Captains of Industry, brought to you by Airtel.
Although we know him as Central Bank Governor of Nigeria, Governor Sanusi is also the grandson of the former Emir of Kano and Islamic scholar Alhaji Muhammadu Sanusi. He's an Islamic scholar himself, and his influence certainly extends beyond the confines of the central bank. So now we get to know a little bit more about the other side, a little more unknown, of Governor Sanusi Lamido Sanusi. Governor, before we take this conversation any further, on a lighter note, and I must say you're disappointed today, I've got to ask, what's behind your love affair with the bow tie?
Well, a friend of mine who studied psychology basically said he thinks it reflects an instinctive sense of being different. I've always, bankers always go around with their tie, and I always liked being different. I didn't do it deliberately, but first I thought it was cute, and soon became my trademark. I remember when I was in UBA, and they did everything to get me to stop with the dress code, and I got to a point where I wanted branded bow ties, and if there's a branded First Bank bow tie, actually, that was made because of me, because I refused to wear the tie, and I was the director, and then we got the bow ties in First Bank. So it's different, I think, and I've always been radical in that sense, always been eccentric.
Well, we see you alternate between the bow tie and the Chinese collar, so that has been noted. In the meantime,
the Chinese collar is my left-wing Marxist history.
Okay,
it's Chairman Mao.
Well, good to know there. As the grandson then of a former emir, you come from a certain pedigree, a leadership pedigree. Have you always had a sense that you were destined to be a leader?
Well, first of all princes grow up wanting to be emirs, and that's leadership. And because of that, you all try to acquire certain values and certain qualities that prepare you for that. And you're expected to behave in a particular way. And you grow up in an environment where your parents, your grandparents, basically have responsibility for society. And therefore you see firsthand what it means to be responsible for running the interests of community. That includes, for instance, placing the interest of the public above your personal interest. It involves sometimes taking very difficult decisions that may be painful to you personally, but which you have to in the interest of the institution. It involves being compassionate and having empathy for those who need protection, because that's ultimately what leadership is about. Government is about standing for those who are unable to stand for themselves, against those who, when given the chance, would take full advantage of them, be they rich people or public servants. I think that is something we all grow up with, and we all encouraged to imbibe. And of course, my own father was a civil servant himself and a career diplomat, and I was very close to him, and he also spent a long time passing on some of these to me.
And naturally, one would assume you're passing this on to your kids as well. What has been your greatest lesson learned that you've carried with you now to your position of leadership?
I think the greatest lesson has been to have a sense of how important it is to do what is right and not what is popular. That keeps getting to me, and that's something my father had always said. And also that it's not how long you stay in a place, but what you do. And in this, my father was a very good, my father was Federal Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs for only 3 years. But that was the period that saw the liberation of Mozambique and Angola and the beginning of the decolonization of Africa. He worked with Murtala and Obasanjo. And that was the period when we started the decolonization of Africa. And throughout his life, he said, look, I was PERMSEC for only 3 years, but I look at Africa. I look at the end of colonialism and apartheid, and I feel proud to have been part of that process. So, for me, as governor of Central Bank, I say, if I leave today, Alicia, it's less than 2 years. I think I've done what some people may not have achieved in 10 years, and that's all that matters.
Well, we know that you're a Muslim. Probably less known is that you're an Islamic scholar. where your quest for knowledge at a stage took you to Sudan to walk away with a degree in Sharia and Islamic studies from the African International University. How does religion inform your leadership role and your worldview?
I think that, ultimately the world and the values that we try to live with are universal. And you find them in every worldview that has gained acceptance. I mean, for example, when I read Islamic philosophy or Islamic theology and mysticism, I'm struck by the similarity with, say, the letters of Seneca, or the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, or the disputations of Cicero. I mean, these are Stoic philosophers that were there prior to Christianity, prior to Islam, and it's the same core values of what is right and what needs to be done. For me, it started basically partly because of my background. As you know, my grandfather was a scholar, but my mother also comes from a long chain of imams. The present chief imam of Kano is her uncle. So both sides have a strong tradition of Islamic scholarship. Mm-hmm. And having had my Western education and having a deep desire to understand the religion, I knew understanding the Arabic language was important. Some of the things that were being said simply didn't sound right to me. And I did realize that part of the problem was we had people who had one worldview, who didn't understand the modern world, who were interpreting religion for us based on texts they read that were written in the 13th century. And so initially I went to the Sudan to study Arabic for a year. And I said, well, I can do more than that. And then I went for the degree. And it's opened my eyes to a whole, worldview, and it's not just Islamic. I tell people that when I hadn't read philosophy before I got to the Sudan. I read Socrates and Plato first in the Arabic. So that was my introduction to Western philosophy in the Sudan.
You're a well-published writer, and I certainly didn't realize the extent to which you wrote before having researched ahead of this interview, and I'm sure many would be surprised. You've delved into issues ranging from economics to history, politics to religion, philosophy even. Is that what you do in your free time? Do you moonlight as a writer?
No, I stopped publishing many things when I became executive director in First Bank, because it then became difficult to separate what my personal view was from what the institution represented, and that was one of the sad periods for me. And it's something, and one of the reasons I'm in a hurry to get out of this job is so that I can get back to writing. I see myself, and I took for myself the role of a public intellectual, and that started from the fact that I started off my life as an academic. I really wanted to be a professor. That was my ambition before I went into banking. I never thought banking gave me the kind of satisfaction that I needed. Look, I got out of the university and went to the bank, and I realized that and I'm sorry to say this, but by using 25% of the intellectual effort I used in the university, I was a superstar. And and that's banking isn't exactly nuclear science. And so I got bored. I do the work, and I needed to continue with the intellectual, and that was in a sense my continued link with the academics. And because I continued writing, I got these invitations. I had a chance to speak at universities all over the world, even though I was a banker, and I kept in touch with the academic community. So that was for me where I got my satisfaction. And now in the central bank, what that has done is it's given me an opportunity in public office to put into action all the things I said as a public intellectual.
Let's take a look at one of the topics there, because you've written about the rights of women in Islam. Why do you feel that you have to add your voice to that kind of conversation?
Because I believe that a number of things that were cultural and historical have been presented as religious. And I do think that, again, it was the part of the philosophy of speaking for those who are oppressed. I think in the whole conversation in religion and religious discourse, the voice of women has been silent. Religion has been interpreted by men in a manner that suited the men themselves, and men see things from their perspective. But the truth is there is abundance of evidence that the role of women in Islam is very, very different from the role envisaged by the Prophet and by the early Muslims. So part of my engagement in the debate has been to say, listen, woman, this is not religion. This is the violence that is meted on you by a male-dominated society.
Well, Governor, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave that conversation there. We've run out of time, but always a pleasure having you here on CNBC Africa. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Alicia.